Margaret Santos had never imagined her life would come to this. At 62 years old, she sat at her small kitchen table on a Tuesday morning, surrounded by a pile of bills she'd been staring at for the past hour. The numbers blurred together after a while, but their message was crystal clear. She was running out of options. Her fingers traced the edge of an envelope from the electric company. Past due. The rent notice sat beneath it, giving her 10 days to catch up. Her small pension check had come and gone like water through her fingers, swallowed up by necessities she could no longer avoid. The arthritis in her hands had taken away her ability to work as a seamstress, the trade she'd practiced for over 30 years. Those same hands that had once created beautiful wedding dresses and tailored suits now struggled to hold a coffee cup without pain. It had been 2 years since Robert passed away. 2 years of learning to navigate the world alone, of figuring out that his income had been covering more than she'd realized, of discovering just how expensive it was to simply exist. They'd never been wealthy, but they'd been comfortable. They'd had each other. Now she had memories and an apartment that felt too big and too quiet all at once. Margaret walked to her refrigerator and opened it, taking inventory for what felt like the 100th time. A carton of eggs half full, some milk that would last another few days if she was careful, 2 loaves of bread she'd found on sale at the corner store, marked down because they were approaching their expiration date, small container of butter, 3 apples that were starting to look tired. That was it. That was everything standing between her and hunger until her next pension check arrived in 2 weeks. She'd gotten good at making meals stretch. Toast for breakfast, a boiled egg and half an apple for lunch, toast again for dinner, sometimes with a little butter if she was feeling particularly hungry. It wasn't much, but it was something. She'd survived on less, she told herself. During the early years of her marriage, when money was tight and Robert was still building his career as a bus driver, they'd learned to make do. This was just another season of making do. The morning sun streamed through her kitchen window and Margaret made herself a cup of tea. She couldn't afford to waste coffee, so she'd been rationing the single box of tea bags she had left. 1 bag used twice, sometimes 3 times if she didn't mind it weak. Small sacrifices that added up to survival. As she sat with her tea, warming her aching hands around the cup, Margaret looked out the window at the street below. Her apartment was on the 2nd floor of an old building in a neighborhood that had seen better days. But it was home. The rent was manageable, most months. Her neighbors were kind. Mrs. Chen from down the hall often invited her for tea on Thursdays, and Mr. Peterson helped her carry groceries when her hands were particularly bad. It was during this quiet moment, while she watched the world wake up outside her window, that Margaret first noticed him. An elderly man sat on the bench at the bus stop across the street. There was nothing particularly unusual about that. People waited for buses all the time. But something made her look twice. Maybe it was the way he sat so utterly still, his shoulders curved inward as if he were trying to make himself smaller. Maybe it was the fact that she'd been watching for 20 minutes and no bus had come, yet he hadn't moved. Margaret finished her tea and tried to focus on other things. She had dishes to wash, a small load of laundry to do by hand because the building's washing machine was broken again. But her eyes kept drifting back to the window, back to that man on the bench. An hour passed. Then another. The man remained. Morning commuters came and went. A young mother with a stroller walked by. A teenager on a skateboard zoomed past. The man sat motionless and Margaret felt something tugging at her heart. She recognized that posture. It was the body language of someone who had nowhere else to go. She thought about Robert and how he'd always been the one to stop and help strangers. He'd given rides to hitchhikers despite her protests. He'd bought meals for homeless people he met on his bus routes. "Maggie," he'd say, using his favorite nickname for her. "You never know when that stranger might be an angel. And even if they're not, everybody needs help sometimes." Margaret shook her head at the memory. She wasn't in a position to help anyone. She could barely help herself. The logical thing to do was to look away, to focus on her own problems, to keep her limited resources for her own survival. That's what any sensible person would do. But she kept looking at that man on the bench. By noon, Margaret had made up her mind to at least check on him. She put on her worn coat, the one with the loose button she kept meaning to fix, and made her way down the stairs and across the street. Up close, she could see that the man was probably in his 70s, with weathered skin and tired eyes that had seen too much. His clothes were clean but old, and he had a small bag at his feet. "Excuse me," Margaret said gently. "Are you all right? You've been sitting here for quite a while." The man looked up at her and she saw surprise flicker across his face, as if he'd forgotten that people could still see him. I'm fine, thank you," he said, but his voice cracked slightly. "Just waiting for the bus?" Margaret asked. "I don't think this line runs very often on Tuesdays." The man's shoulders sagged a little more. "To be honest with you, ma'am, I'm not sure what I'm waiting for anymore." Something in his voice broke Margaret's heart. She'd heard that tone before, in her own voice late at night when the loneliness became too heavy to bear. It was the sound of someone who'd run out of options and was too tired to pretend otherwise. "Would you like to tell me what happened?" she asked, sitting down on the bench beside him, even though her arthritis protested the cold metal surface. And slowly, haltingly, the man's story came out. His name was Thomas. He'd been traveling to see his daughter 3 states away, Sarah, who he hadn't seen in almost a year. She'd just had a baby, his first grandchild, and he'd saved up for months to afford the bus ticket. But last night, while he'd been at the station waiting for his connection, someone had stolen his bag. Everything was in it. His wallet with his identification and money, his phone, his ticket, even the small gift he'd bought for the baby. "I reported it to the police," Thomas said, his voice hollow. "They were kind enough, took a report, said they'd look into it. But we both knew nothing would come of it. These things happen in bus stations. I'm just another old fool who wasn't paying attention." "You're not a fool," Margaret said firmly. "You're a grandfather trying to meet his grandchild." "That's beautiful, not foolish." Thomas managed a weak smile. "Beautiful or not, I'm stuck. Can't buy a new ticket. Can't even call my daughter to tell her what happened. I used the phone at the station to call her number, but it went straight to voicemail. She's probably at work. I left a message, but..." He trailed off, looking down at his hands. "I haven't eaten since yesterday afternoon. Used my last few dollars on a sandwich before the bag got stolen." Margaret felt her chest tighten. She thought about the 2 loaves of bread in her refrigerator, the eggs, the careful rationing she'd planned for the next 2 weeks. She thought about her own empty stomach and the bills on her kitchen table. Every reasonable part of her brain screamed that she couldn't afford to help this man, that she had to take care of herself first. But she also thought about Robert, about his kindness, about the way he'd always said that being poor didn't mean you had to be heartless. She thought about all the times strangers had helped her in small ways since his death. The neighbor who'd left soup at her door when she was sick, the pharmacist who'd let her pay for her arthritis medication 2 days late, the bus driver who'd waved away her fare when she'd come up short one day. Margaret made a decision that defied logic. She stood up, her knees protesting, and looked at Thomas with determination she didn't quite feel. "You wait here," she said. "I'll be right back." Thomas started to protest, but Margaret was already walking back across the street, her mind made up even as doubt nipped at her heels. She climbed the stairs to her apartment, each step feeling heavier than the last. Inside, she went straight to the refrigerator and stared at its meager contents. 2 loaves of bread. That was supposed to last her 14 days. If she gave one away, she'd have to make the other stretch twice as long. Half a slice in the morning, half a slice at night. Could she do that? Her stomach already felt hollow most days. The thought of being even hungrier made her lightheaded. But then she imagined Thomas sitting on that bench all day and into the night, cold and hungry and alone. She imagined him trying to sleep there, or worse, trying to walk somewhere with no destination in mind. She imagined him as someone's father, someone's grandfather. What if that was Robert out there, and some stranger walked past without helping? Margaret pulled out one of the loaves and wrapped it carefully in a clean kitchen towel. Then she boiled 4 eggs using the ones she'd planned for her own meals that week. She wrapped those too, still warm. It wasn't much, but it was something. It was all she could spare, and maybe more than she should. Her hands shook slightly as she prepared the small bundle. Not from the arthritis this time, but from fear. Fear of what this choice might cost her. Fear of going hungry. Fear of not making it to her next pension check. But beneath the fear was something else. A small, stubborn warmth that felt like the best parts of Robert still living inside her. She walked back down to the bus stop, holding the bundle against her chest. Thomas looked up as she approached, and his eyes widened when he saw what she carried. "Oh no," he said immediately, raising his hands. "No, ma'am, I couldn't." "You can and you will," Margaret said. placing the bundle in his lap with a gentleness that belied her firm tone. "It's not fancy, but it's good bread and fresh eggs. It'll keep you going until you figure out your next step." Thomas unwrapped the towel with trembling fingers. When he saw the bread and eggs, his eyes filled with tears. "This is too much," he whispered. "You don't even know me." "I know enough," Margaret said. "I know you're a grandfather trying to get to your daughter. I know you've had a terrible day. I know you're hungry. That's all I need to know." "But what about you?" Thomas asked, looking up at her with those tired, grateful eyes. "You don't look like someone who can afford to give away food." Margaret felt her cheeks flush. Was it that obvious? Could he see her worn coat, her thin frame, the worry lines that had deepened in the past 2 years? "I have enough," she said, and the lie tasted bitter on her tongue. "You need this more than I do right now." Thomas held the bundle like it was something precious. "At least let me get your address," he said. "When I get to my daughter's, when I figure things out, I want to pay you back." Margaret shook her head. "Kindness doesn't need repayment," she said, echoing something Robert used to tell her. "Just promise me you'll help someone else when you get the chance. That's payment enough." "I don't even know your name," Thomas said. "Margaret," she replied. "Margaret Santos. And you don't need to remember it. Just remember to be kind when you can." She turned to leave before he could protest further, before she could change her mind, before the reality of what she'd done could sink in too deeply. As she walked away, she heard Thomas call out behind her, "God bless you, Margaret Santos." "God bless you." Back in her apartment, Margaret returned to her kitchen and opened the refrigerator again. 1 loaf of bread stared back at her. Half a carton of eggs, now missing 4. The milk, the butter, the 3 tired apples. She did the math in her head. 14 days until her next check. 1 loaf of bread, 4 eggs. She'd have to get creative. She'd have to be more careful than ever. That night, Margaret ate half a slice of bread with a thin scrape of butter. Her stomach growled, unsatisfied, but she ignored it. She'd made her choice. She'd have to live with it. The next few days passed in a blur of careful rationing. Margaret became an expert at making nothing feel like something. She toasted her bread slowly so it would seem more substantial. She ate 1 egg every 3 days, making it last by cutting it into thin slices and spreading them over her bread. She made the apples last by eating 1 slice per day, letting each piece sit in her mouth until it dissolved. Mrs. Chen knocked on her door on Thursday, as she always did, inviting Margaret to their weekly tea gathering in the building's small common room. It was a tradition. Several of the older residents would gather, bringing whatever treats they could spare, sharing stories and company. Margaret had always looked forward to it, but this week she couldn't go. The thought of watching other people eat, even the simple cookies and crackers they usually shared, was too much. She'd have to smell the food, see it, and pretend she wasn't desperately hungry. Worse, someone might offer her something out of kindness, and she was afraid she wouldn't be able to refuse politely. She was afraid she'd break down and admit just how dire things had become. "I'm not feeling well," Margaret told Mrs. Chen through the partially opened door, hating herself for the lie. "Just need to rest today." Mrs. Chen, a petite woman in her 70s with sharp, observant eyes, looked concerned. "Are you sure? You look pale, Margaret. Can I bring you some soup later?" No, Margaret said quickly. "I have everything I need. Just a little tired. I'll be fine by next week." But Mrs. Chen didn't look convinced. She studied Margaret's face for a long moment before nodding slowly. "All right, but you call me if you need anything at all." After Mrs. Chen left, Margaret felt the weight of isolation settle over her like a heavy blanket. She'd pushed away help because pride wouldn't let her admit the truth. Because she was ashamed of giving away food she couldn't afford to lose. Because accepting help felt like admitting defeat. By day 6, Margaret started to feel the real effects of hunger. Not just the empty stomach she'd grown used to, but a deeper weakness that made her dizzy when she stood up too quickly. Her hands shook more than usual, though whether from the arthritis or malnutrition she couldn't say. She found herself sleeping more, partly because it passed the time, partly because sleeping meant not thinking about food. She thought about Thomas often. She wondered if he'd made it to his daughter. She wondered if the bread and eggs had helped. Part of her regretted her choice, the selfish, survival-focused part that grew louder with each hungry day. But another part, the part that sounded like Robert's voice in her head, felt at peace. She'd done the right thing. She'd chosen compassion over comfort. That had to count for something. On Sunday, Margaret went to church. She'd been attending the small parish down the street for years, finding comfort in the ritual and community, even as her own faith wavered. She sat in the back pew as she always did, and tried to focus on Father Miguel's sermon about caring for the least among us. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, one of the least among them, and she'd just given away her resources to help someone else who was in need. Was that righteous or ridiculous? Noble or naive? She wasn't sure anymore. After the service, Father Miguel caught her at the door. He was a kind man in his 50s, with graying hair and eyes that seemed to see straight through people's defenses. "Margaret," he said warmly, "I haven't seen you at the community meals lately. We miss you." The church hosted free meals twice a week for anyone who needed them. Margaret had helped serve at them for years, but she'd never taken food for herself. That was for people who really needed it, she'd always thought. People worse off than her. "I've been busy," she said, which wasn't quite a lie. Being poor was time-consuming. Figuring out how to survive on nothing took constant mental energy. Father Miguel studied her face much like Mrs. Chen had done. "You know," he said carefully, "the food pantry is open tomorrow. If you ever need anything, that's what it's there for." No shame in it. Margaret felt her cheeks burn. "Oh, I'm fine, Father, really, but thank you." "There are others who need it more." "Pride is a tricky thing," Father Miguel said gently. "Sometimes it protects us. Sometimes it hurts us. The trick is knowing which is which." Margaret nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She hurried out before he could say more, before her facade could crack entirely. Outside, the autumn air felt sharp against her skin. Or maybe she was just feeling everything more acutely these days. That night she ate her ration, a third of a slice of bread, and felt something close to despair. 8 more days until her pension check. Half a loaf of bread left. 2 eggs, the milk was gone. The butter nearly finished. The apples were gone too, consumed in tiny increments that had only made her hungrier. She could make it, she told herself. She'd made it through worse. But had she? She couldn't remember a time when the cupboards had been this bare, when the future had felt this uncertain. Margaret lay in bed that night, her stomach a tight, angry knot, and thought about the choices that had led her here, giving Thomas that food, refusing Mrs. Chen's soup, declining Father Miguel's offer of the food pantry. Each choice made sense in the moment, but together they formed a pattern of self-sacrifice that was starting to look like self-destruction. But even in her hunger, even in her growing weakness, Margaret couldn't bring herself to regret helping Thomas. The image of his grateful tears, the way he'd held that simple bundle of bread and eggs like it was treasure, that meant something. In a life that had become small and difficult, that moment of pure human connection had made her feel like herself again, like the Margaret who had existed before bills and arthritis and loneliness had whittled her down to bare survival. She fell asleep thinking about Robert, about the way he used to pull her close on cold nights, about the sound of his laugh, about the life they'd built together out of love and small kindnesses. If he could see her now, would he be proud of what she'd done? Or would he be disappointed that she was suffering needlessly, that she was too proud to accept the help she'd earned by helping others? Margaret didn't have answers. She only had 8 more days to survive, half a loaf of bread, and a choice she couldn't take back. Tomorrow would come whether she was ready for it or not. All she could do was face it with whatever strength she had left. The 8th day started like the others had, with Margaret lying in bed longer than necessary, gathering the energy to face another day. The weakness had become constant now, a heavy presence that made every movement feel like wading through deep water. When she finally stood, the room tilted slightly, and she had to grip the nightstand until her vision cleared. In the kitchen, she calculated her remaining resources with the precision of someone who had no margin for error. 3 slices of bread left, 2 eggs, a few spoonfuls of butter, 4 days until her pension check arrived. The math was simple and unforgiving. She'd have to stretch what remained even thinner than before. Margaret made herself tea, reusing yesterday's tea bag for the 3rd time. The resulting liquid was barely colored, more like hot water with a memory of tea, but it was warm and it filled her stomach temporarily. She sat by the window with her cup, watching the neighborhood come to life below. That's when she noticed Mrs. Chen standing on the sidewalk, looking up at her building. But she wasn't alone. Next to her stood a younger woman, perhaps in her 40s, well-dressed in a way that spoke of professional success. They seemed to be having an intense conversation, with Mrs. Chen gesturing toward the building and the younger woman nodding seriously. Margaret felt a flutter of unease. She'd been avoiding Mrs. Chen's invitations and questions for over a week now. Had her neighbor noticed more than Margaret realized? Had she said something to someone? The knock came 20 minutes later, firm but not aggressive. Margaret considered not answering, but that seemed childish. She smoothed her hair, thinner than it used to be she'd noticed lately, and opened the door. Mrs. Chen stood there with the well-dressed woman from the sidewalk. Up close, Margaret could see the kindness in the younger woman's eyes, mixed with something that looked like determination. "Margaret," Mrs. Chen said warmly, "this is my niece, Dr. Sarah Chen. She's visiting from out of state, and she insisted on meeting you." The name hit Margaret like a physical blow. Chen Sarah, out of state. The pieces clicked together in her mind with startling clarity, but she couldn't quite believe what they suggested. "Mrs. Santos," Sarah said, her voice thick with emotion. "May we come in? I have something important to tell you." Margaret stepped aside, suddenly self-conscious about her sparse apartment, the carefully washed dishes drying by the sink, the single chair at her kitchen table. But Sarah and Mrs. Chen entered without judgment, their focus entirely on Margaret. "I know you," Sarah said once they were seated, Sarah and Mrs. Chen squeezing together on the small couch. Margaret on her kitchen chair carried over. "Or rather, I know what you did. You helped my father." Margaret's hand flew to her mouth. "Thomas, you're Thomas's daughter?" Sarah nodded, tears already forming in her eyes. "He made it to me, Mrs. Santos. The food you gave him, that bread and those eggs, they kept him going. He used a phone at a library to call me again, and I was able to send him money for a new ticket. He arrived 3 days ago." "Thank God," Margaret whispered, feeling relief wash over her despite her own circumstances. "I've been wondering, worrying, is he all right?" "He is now," Sarah said. "But Mrs. Santos, he told me everything. About being robbed, about sitting on that bench with nowhere to go, about the angel who gave him food when she clearly had so little herself." Sarah's voice cracked. "He described the street, the building, said you were an older woman with kind eyes and a worn blue coat. Aunt Grace put it together. She'd noticed you seemed unwell lately, that you'd been avoiding everyone." Mrs. Chen reached over and touched Margaret's hand. "I knew something was wrong, dear. You look so thin, so tired. When Sarah arrived yesterday and told me about her father's story, I realized it had to be you. The blue coat, this building, the timing, it all fit." Margaret felt exposed, as if all her careful pretending had been stripped away. "I'm fine," she said automatically, the lie familiar on her tongue. "Really, I'm just glad your father is safe, Sarah." "You're not fine," Sarah said gently but firmly. "Mrs. Santos, my father hasn't eaten since yesterday morning because he's been so worried about you. He made me promise, made me swear, that I'd find you and make sure you were okay. He said you gave him what looked like your last food." "It wasn't my last," Margaret protested weakly. I have enough." Sarah stood and walked to Margaret's kitchen. Before Margaret could stop her, she opened the refrigerator. The nearly empty interior spoke louder than any words. 3 slices of bread, 2 eggs, a nearly empty butter container. "Mrs. Santos," Sarah said, turning back with tears streaming down her face. "You gave my father your food. You kept him from starving, maybe saved his life, and you've been going hungry yourself." "I made a choice," Margaret said, feeling her own tears come now. "Your father needed help. I had something to give. It's not more complicated than that." "But it is," Sarah insisted, coming back to sit directly in front of Margaret. "Because you didn't just help a stranger. You helped yourself into a crisis. Aunt Grace says your pension doesn't come for 4 more days. How are you going to make 3 slices of bread last 4 days? Margaret had no answer. The truth was, she didn't know. She'd been taking it one day at a time, hoping she'd figure something out, hoping her body would hold on a little longer. Sarah opened the large bag she'd brought with her. "My father wanted to repay you immediately, but I told him I had a better idea. We both did." She began pulling out groceries, real, substantial food. Bread, fresh vegetables, rice, canned goods, eggs, cheese, milk, chicken. Margaret watched in stunned silence as her counter filled with more food than she'd seen in months. "This isn't charity," Sarah said, seeing Margaret's expression. "This is gratitude. This is recognition. This is one human being thanking another for an act of genuine compassion." "I can't accept all this," Margaret said, even as her stomach growled audibly at the sight of real food. "You can and you will," Sarah echoed Margaret's own words back to her, the ones she'd used with Thomas. "But that's not all." She pulled out an envelope. "Mrs. Santos, I work as a hospital administrator at Mercy General, about 30 minutes from here. My father told me about your arthritis, about how you lost your job as a seamstress. I made some calls." Margaret's heart began to pound. "What kind of calls?" "Our reception area needs someone," Sarah explained. "It's not physically demanding. Mostly answering phones, directing visitors, some light computer work. The pay is decent and it comes with full health insurance, which means treatment for your arthritis. Real treatment, not just managing the pain." Margaret felt the room spin. This couldn't be real. Things like this didn't happen to people like her. I don't understand. Why would you do this?" "Because you saved my father's life," Sarah said simply. "The doctor who examined him when he arrived said he was severely dehydrated and malnourished. Another day or two in that condition, especially at his age, and he could have suffered serious complications. You gave him food when you had nothing to spare. You chose compassion over self-preservation. That's not something we can ever truly repay, but we can try." Mrs. Chen squeezed Margaret's other hand. "And because you're part of this community, dear. You've been here for years, always kind, always helpful when you could be. We take care of our own." Margaret looked between them, these two women offering her a lifeline when she'd been too proud to admit she was drowning. "I don't know what to say." "Say you'll come for an interview next week," Sarah urged. "Say you'll accept this food without guilt. Say you'll let us help you the way you helped my father." The tears came in earnest now, years of held-back emotion breaking through Margaret's carefully maintained walls. She thought about Robert, about how he'd always helped others despite their limited means. She thought about Thomas on that bench, about the choice she'd made that should have felt reckless but had felt like the only human thing to do. She thought about the past 8 days of hunger and fear and doubt. "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, yes. Thank you." Sarah pulled Margaret into a hug and Mrs. Chen joined them, and for the first time in a very long time, Margaret didn't feel alone. The weight of survival that she'd been carrying on her thin shoulders seemed to lighten, just a bit. They spent the next hour putting away groceries and talking. Sarah explained that the hospital position would start in 2 weeks if Margaret was interested, giving her time to prepare. She'd need to come in for a formal interview, but Sarah was confident it would go well. The work wasn't difficult, and they specifically wanted someone mature and compassionate for the front desk role. Mrs. Chen made tea, real, strong tea from a fresh box Sarah had brought, and insisted Margaret eat something immediately. Margaret found herself with a sandwich in her hands, real meat and cheese and fresh vegetables, and she had to eat slowly to keep from making herself sick after days of near starvation. "My father wants to meet with you again," Sarah said as they prepared to leave. "Once you're feeling stronger. He's been working on something, a project he's calling it, and he wants your input." "What kind of project?" Margaret asked. Sarah smiled mysteriously.
"He'll explain it better than I can."
"But it involves the church, Father Miguel, and helping other people in situations like his, like yours." After they left, Margaret sat in her apartment surrounded by bags of groceries, holding the envelope with information about her job interview. She walked to her refrigerator and opened it, seeing it full for the first time in months. The sight made her cry again, but these were different tears. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of hope rekindling after she'd thought it was gone forever. She made herself a proper dinner that night. Nothing fancy, just scrambled eggs with cheese, toast with butter, and an apple that wasn't bruised or old. Every bite tasted like a miracle. Her body, shocked by actual nutrition, seemed to wake up, reminding her what it felt like to have energy, to have strength. Before bed, Margaret stood at her window and looked out at the bus stop where Thomas had sat over a week ago. The bench was empty now, just a piece of street furniture that meant nothing to most people but meant everything to her. That bench represented a choice, a moment when she'd listened to the better angels of her nature despite every practical reason not to. She thought about cause and effect, about how one small act of kindness had rippled outward in ways she never could have predicted. She'd given bread and eggs to a stranger, and somehow that had circled back to save her in return. It wasn't magic. It was simply humanity recognizing and responding to humanity. It was people choosing to care. Robert would have loved this story, Margaret thought. He would have laughed his big, booming laugh and said, "See, Maggie, I told you." Kindness always comes back around. Maybe it did, or maybe she'd just gotten lucky. But lying in bed that night with a full stomach and the promise of a job in her future, Margaret chose to believe in something bigger than luck. She chose to believe that compassion mattered, that small acts of goodness could change lives, that giving away her last bread to a stranger had been exactly the right thing to do. The 4 remaining days until her pension check passed differently than the 8 before them. Margaret ate regular meals. She felt her strength returning gradually, her mind clearing from the fog of hunger. She prepared for her interview, practicing what she'd say, imagining a future where she could pay her bills and maybe even help others the way she'd been helped. It wasn't a miracle. It was better than that. It was proof that kindness was real, that people could be good, that reaching out in someone's darkest moment could illuminate your own. The morning of Margaret's interview arrived with autumn sunlight streaming through her windows. She stood before her small closet, examining her limited options with a critical eye she hadn't employed in years. Most of her clothes were old, worn from repeated washing and countless wears. But tucked in the back, she found a navy dress she'd made herself 15 years ago, barely worn because there had been so few occasions for it. She paired it with her best cardigan, the one without pills or loose threads, and looked at herself in the mirror. The woman staring back surprised her. A week of proper meals had already started to fill in the hollow spaces in her cheeks. Her eyes looked clearer, more alert. She stood a little straighter, her arthritis bothering her less than usual. Whether from better nutrition or renewed hope, she couldn't say. Mrs. Chen knocked on her door right on schedule. "Ready, dear?" she asked, beaming. "Sarah said she'd meet you in the lobby." The drive to Mercy General Hospital took 35 minutes through morning traffic. Margaret watched the neighborhoods change as they drove, from her familiar worn streets to more prosperous areas with well-maintained buildings and landscaped medians. The hospital itself was impressive, a modern building with large windows and a welcoming entrance. Sarah met her inside, professional in her work attire but warm in her greeting. "Mrs. Santos, you look wonderful. Are you feeling better?" "Much better," Margaret admitted. "Thank you. For everything." The interview was conducted by Sarah and the head of Human Resources, a kind middle-aged man named David Brennan. They asked about her previous work experience, her comfort with people, her ability to handle a multi-line phone system. Margaret answered honestly, acknowledging that she'd need training on the computer systems but emphasizing her decades of customer service experience and her genuine desire to help people. "We're not looking for technical expertise," David explained. "We can teach you the systems. What we need is someone who can make scared, confused, or hurting people feel seen and cared for. Someone who can be the friendly face that welcomes them and guides them. From what Sarah has told me about you, I think you might be exactly what we need." By the end of the hour, Margaret had been offered the position. She'd start in 2 weeks, giving her time to complete her paperwork and attend a few training sessions. The salary was more than she'd made as a seamstress, and the health insurance would cover not just her arthritis treatments but regular checkups, dental work, even vision care. "There's a bus route that stops right near your apartment and comes directly here," Sarah told her as they walked back to the lobby. "Door to door in 40 minutes. And the employee cafeteria offers free lunch to all staff." Free lunch. Margaret had to concentrate on not crying right there in the hospital hallway. Free lunch meant one less meal to budget for. More money to cover other needs, less stress about making food last. "My father wants to see you this weekend," Sarah added. "Are you free on Saturday afternoon?" "Of course," Margaret said. "I'd love to see him again." Saturday arrived with the crisp clarity of late autumn. Sarah picked Margaret up at noon and drove her to a small house in a quiet neighborhood. Thomas opened the door before they'd even reached the porch, his face breaking into the widest smile. "Margaret," he called out, and suddenly she found herself wrapped in a gentle hug from this man she'd met only once before. "Let me look at you. Sarah said you were doing better, but I had to see for myself." Inside, the house smelled like fresh coffee and something sweet baking in the oven. Thomas led her to a comfortable living room where Father Miguel sat waiting, along with a woman Margaret didn't recognize. "Mrs. Santos." Father Miguel greeted her warmly. "Thomas has been telling me quite a story. I had no idea you were the one who helped him. Though I'm not surprised, you've always had a generous heart." "Too generous almost," Thomas added, his expression turning serious. "Margaret, when I sat on that bench that day, I had given up. I was cold, hungry, scared, and I couldn't see a way forward. Then you appeared with food and kindness, and it literally saved my life. Sarah's doctor confirmed it. Another day or two in that condition could have been catastrophic at my age. You don't have to keep thanking me, Margaret said softly. I'm just glad you're well. But that's just it, Thomas continued. Your kindness didn't just help me. It changed me. It reminded me that even when we have nothing material to offer, we can still choose compassion. We can still choose to see each other as human beings deserving of dignity. He leaned forward, his eyes intense. It made me want to do something, to create something that could help others the way you helped me. The unknown woman spoke up then. My name is Patricia Winters. I'm the director of community outreach for several local churches, including Father Miguel's parish. Thomas came to us with an idea, and we've been working together to make it happen. Thomas pulled out a folder and opened it, showing Margaret a simple flyer. At the top it read, "The Bread and Hope Fund supporting our neighbors in crisis." It's a micro-grant program, Thomas explained, his excitement evident. Small amounts of money, $200, $300, given quickly to people facing temporary emergencies. A broken car that needs fixing so someone can get to work, an unexpected medical bill, a rent payment when someone's between paychecks, the kind of situations that can spiral into homelessness or hunger if not addressed quickly. Father Miguel nodded. We've seen it so many times in our community. Good people, responsible people who hit one rough patch and suddenly everything falls apart. The existing social services are helpful, but they're often slow, bureaucratic, difficult to navigate. This would be different, fast, compassionate, no judgment. I'm seeding it with my retirement savings, Thomas said. Not all of it. Sarah made me promise to be sensible, but a substantial amount. And Patricia has been reaching out to local businesses and community members for donations. We officially launch next month. Margaret listened, moved by the vision they were describing. That's beautiful, she said. It'll help so many people. We want you to be part of it, Thomas said. Not as someone who needs help, though you're welcome to that support if you ever need it, but as someone who helps identify recipients and distribute funds. Margaret blinked. Me? But I don't have any training in social work or— You have something better, Patricia interrupted. You have empathy. You have experience with hardship. You understand what it means to need help and to be too proud to ask for it. Thomas says you gave away food you couldn't afford to lose. That tells me you understand sacrifice and you understand dignity. The position would be volunteer, Father Miguel explained. A few hours a week working with us to review requests and make decisions. We'd meet here at the church or at Thomas's house. And Margaret, we'd value your voice because you've lived this. You know what it's like to count pennies, to choose between needs, to sacrifice. That perspective is invaluable. Margaret felt overwhelmed. A week ago she'd been hungry and frightened, seeing no path forward. Now she had a job, enough food, and people asking her to help shape a program that could change lives. I don't know what to say. Say yes, Thomas urged. Help us build something good out of that terrible day. Help us turn what happened to both of us into hope for others. We've already received our first requests, Patricia added, pulling out several handwritten letters. A single mother whose car broke down and she might lose her job without transportation. An elderly man who needs new glasses to keep his part-time work, but can't afford them until next month. A family facing eviction because the father's hours were cut unexpectedly. Margaret read through the requests, seeing her own struggles reflected in each story. These were her neighbors, her community, people trying their best but coming up short through no fault of their own. Yes, she said quietly. Then stronger, yes, I want to help. I want to be part of this. The afternoon stretched into evening as they talked through the details. The fund would operate through the church with a small committee, Thomas, Father Miguel, Patricia, Mrs. Chen, and now Margaret, reviewing requests weekly. They'd start small, helping a few people each month, and grow as donations allowed. Your first official job, Thomas told Margaret with a smile, is to help me deliver news to that single mother about her car. Her name is Jessica Martinez, and she submitted her request last week before we'd even fully set up the fund. But we've got enough in the account now. We're giving her $400, enough to fix the car and give her a small buffer. The next day, Margaret found herself standing with Thomas outside a small apartment complex, her hands clutching an envelope. Jessica answered the door with a toddler on her hip and worry etched across her young face. Ms. Martinez? Thomas began. I'm Thomas and this is Margaret. We're from the Bread and Hope Fund through St. Anthony's Church. Jessica's eyes welled with tears before Thomas even finished. You're here about my request? I hoped, but I didn't want to get my hopes up. The committee reviewed your application, Margaret said gently, finding her voice. Your request is approved. We're giving you a grant of $400 for your car repair. Jessica's knees buckled slightly and she leaned against the doorframe. You're serious? This isn't a loan? I don't have to pay it back? It's a grant, Thomas confirmed. No repayment required. We just ask that when you're back on your feet, if you're ever able to help someone else, you do so. Jessica set her toddler down and took the envelope with shaking hands. When she opened it and saw the check, she started crying in earnest. You have no idea what this means. I was going to lose my job tomorrow if I couldn't get to work. And if I lost my job, I'd lose this apartment and then I don't know what we'd do. Margaret stepped forward and hugged this young woman she'd never met before. We know, she said softly. We know exactly what it means. That's why we're here. Over the following weeks, Margaret settled into a rhythm she never could have imagined a month earlier. Her mornings were spent at the hospital reception desk, greeting patients and families with the warmth and compassion that came naturally to her. The work was more fulfilling than she'd expected, helping lost visitors find their way, offering a kind word to scared patients, connecting people with the services they needed. Her evenings and weekends were split between recovering her own strength and working with the Bread and Hope Fund. They helped the elderly man get his glasses. They kept a family from being evicted. They paid for groceries for a woman whose paycheck had been delayed due to a banking error. Small interventions that prevented small problems from becoming catastrophic ones. At one of their weekly meetings, Mrs. Chen raised an interesting point. We're helping people in crisis, she said. But what about preventing the crisis in the first place? What if we also created a kind of community network? People checking on each other, sharing resources, catching problems early. Like neighbors helping neighbors, Margaret mused. The way you helped me, Grace. The way you noticed something was wrong and brought Sarah to me. Exactly, Mrs. Chen agreed. We could have regular community meals, not just for people in need, but for everyone. Build relationships so people aren't isolated when they struggle. The idea grew from there. Within 2 months, St. Anthony's Church was hosting monthly community dinners, free and open to all, with no distinction made between those who needed a free meal and those who simply wanted community. Margaret helped organize them, amazed at how many people came, not just for food, but for connection. At one of these dinners, Margaret sat next to an older gentleman named Harold, who reminded her of Robert. He was recently widowed, clearly lonely, obviously struggling with his new reality. It's the little things that get you, Harold confided, making dinner for one. No one to talk to in the evenings. I never realized how much she did until she was gone. Margaret understood completely. It's an adjustment, she said. But it does get easier. Not better exactly, but easier. You learn to carry it. How long has it been for you? Harold asked. 2 years, Margaret said. And honestly, I'm only just now finding my footing again. It took a long time, and some help from unexpected sources. They talked for over an hour, sharing stories of their spouses, their struggles, their small victories in learning to live alone. When the dinner ended, Harold thanked her and she saw some of the loneliness in his eyes had lifted. This is why we do this, Father Miguel said, watching the exchange. Not just to feed bodies, but to feed souls. Connection is as necessary as bread. Margaret thought about that later, alone in her apartment that no longer felt quite so empty. Connection was as necessary as bread. She'd given bread to Thomas, but she'd also given connection. Recognition of his humanity in a moment when he felt invisible. And in return, she'd received not just food and employment, but connection to a community that saw her, valued her, needed her. The circle was complete, but it wasn't closed. It kept expanding outward, touching new people, creating new connections, sparking new acts of kindness. Margaret had started it with 1 loaf of bread and 4 eggs, and now it was becoming something larger than she could have imagined. 3 months into her new job, Margaret stood at the hospital's reception desk on a particularly busy morning, directing a steady stream of visitors with practiced ease. She'd learned the computer systems quickly, memorized the layout of the sprawling facility, and become known among staff and regular patients as the woman with the warm smile, who always seemed to know exactly how to help. Margaret, one of the nurses called out as she passed. Thank you for calming down that gentleman earlier. He was in a panic about being late for his wife's appointment, and you got him there with 5 minutes to spare. Margaret waved off the compliment, but inside she felt a glow of satisfaction. This work mattered. Every day she helped people navigate one of the most stressful experiences of their lives, seeking medical care for themselves or loved ones. Being kind, being patient, being helpful, these weren't small things. They were everything. During her lunch break, which she now took in the employee cafeteria with a few of the other administrative staff, her phone buzzed with a text from Thomas. Emergency fund meeting tonight. Important decision. Can you make it? Margaret replied that she'd be there, then spent the rest of her shift wondering what the important decision might be. The fund had been growing steadily. Word was spreading through the community and donations were trickling in from local businesses and individuals. They'd helped 37 people so far, and each success story seemed to inspire others to contribute. That evening, Margaret arrived at Thomas's house to find the whole committee assembled, plus several people she didn't recognize. Thomas stood at the front of the room with barely contained excitement. Everyone, thank you for coming on short notice, he began. We've received an offer and I wanted the whole committee's input before responding. He held up a letter. This is from the Community Foundation. They've been watching what we're doing with the Bread and Hope Fund and they're impressed. They want to give us a substantial grant, $50,000, to expand our operations. The room erupted in excited chatter. $50,000 could help hundreds of people. But there are conditions, Thomas continued, raising his hand for quiet. They want us to formalize our structure, incorporate as a nonprofit, hire a part-time coordinator, and expand to serve the entire county rather than just our immediate neighborhood. It would mean more work for all of us, more responsibility, but also more impact. Patricia spoke up. I've reviewed the grant terms and they're reasonable. The foundation isn't trying to control what we do. They just want accountability and broader reach. With that kind of funding, we could help not just with emergency grants but also financial literacy classes, job training referrals, connection to other social services. It would change the nature of what we're doing, Father Miguel added thoughtfully. We'd grow from an informal group of neighbors helping neighbors to an actual organization. That's not necessarily bad, but it's different. Margaret listened to the discussion, feeling the weight of the decision. She thought about that morning weeks ago when she'd stood in her kitchen, counting out her last resources, making the choice to give bread to Thomas. She'd acted on pure instinct and compassion, with no thought of organizations or grants or structured programs. It had been simple and human. What do you think, Margaret? Thomas asked, turning to her. You're the reason any of this exists. Your voice matters most here.